Hello, this is First Zapata. Last time we talked about major areas in psychology. Today we're going to narrow it down to clinical psychology, which is the area that I specialize in. And we're going to talk about major psychotherapeutic theories in clinical psychology. These would be the viewpoints that help us guide patients through their problems. All right? We're going to do a quick overview, but this will be a quite longer class than last time. Okay, so the first question that one person might ask is, why do we even have different perspectives in the first place? The first thing that we need to consider is that humans need multidimensional understanding. So what that means in simpler terms is that um, humans are very, very complex creatures. We cannot have a single unified theory to understand them. We need several tools to understand humans properly. And this will be because humans are so varied that we will need various lenses to effectively help as many people as possible. If we narrow it down to a single theory, we would miss out on a lot of tools that would otherwise help other people, that maybe that set of tools doesn't help, right? So that's one thing. Humans are very, very, very different, and we need as many tools as possible to help them. The other thing is that difference in ideas, sorry, difference in ideas between different theories. So often the people that write these theories have disagreements on how humans work, and this means that sometimes theories are irreconcilable between each other. So they're mutually exclusive, right? We're going to talk about it in a moment when we get to the specific theories. As I said earlier, this also gives us a larger sample of tools to choose from. And what people don't often think about is that this is often the case in other sciences too, even in natural sciences. If you study physics, for example, you will see that physicists also use different theories when it comes to different phenomena in physics. So psychology is no different in that regard. We just have a more robust set of tools to help people out, okay? So now we're going to talk about the original psychotherapeutic theory, which would be psychoanalysis. So according to psychoanalysts, mental health issues stem from unconscious thoughts, okay? So we're going to talk about it a bit more about that, but what that basically means is that psychoanalysts think that our problems come from things or stuff that we do not have conscious access to. So if I try to think about my problems, I would have unconscious drives that would not be accessible to me at all moments. So to address that, psychoanalysis, in this case Freud, which is the guy that you can see on screen right now, developed a very complex theory of how the unconscious works. This was very influenced by medical theories, since Freud was actually a doctor. There was no psychotherapy by that point. And they were pretty influential in all of the theories. All other theories are basically like refutations of Freud, or they are amendments to Freud's theory. So that makes studying psychoanalysis, even if you don't like it very much, it makes it very, very useful because it gives you context in how the other theories work. Some other theories here are Erikson and Jung, who were also students of Freud, actually. Jung was, in fact, part of the original body of colleagues in Freud's institution. So some concepts that are important in psychoanalysis would be the unconscious mind. As I've said before, we're not aware about everything in ourselves. This is by now a pretty popular idea. So it's hard to think how revolutionary this was back in Freud's time. Freud wrote most of his writings over 100 years ago. And by that time, unconscious mind in the way that we think about it today was not a popular thing. So Freud was the first person not to talk about the unconscious mind, but he was the first one to talk about it in a theoretical sense and to apply it in a practical scenario. So what Freud did was take some of his patients, apply the theory to them by something that he called talk therapy, which was a pretty new thing back then. Nowadays, we think about the classical, well, a lot of people still have the image that Freud had of therapy, which you would have like a divan, and you would have like the therapist like perpendicular to you, just giving the back to you and writing, right? A lot of us still have that that concept of therapy. It's not completely wrong because Freud did in fact pioneer therapy in this way. And some people still practice therapy in that way, in fact. It's a minority of people, but it still happens. And Freud was the first person to popularize the idea that you could help people by talking to them in this way, okay? So that's basically how the unconscious mind works. You talk through people and help them see the unconscious patterns that are informing their decisions so they can make a more informed decision that they can make in their conscious thoughts. That's a very simplified model, but that's basically how it works. We don't have time to get into the specifics of psychoanalysis. Like I said, it's a very complex theory. Another important concept there would be resistances. We don't always allow change to happen easily. This was also a pretty influential concept, and basically all therapists agree that resistances exist, right? So sometimes patients would push back in several ways. Sorry. There are several different kinds of resistances. The most common one that people know about is called denial, when we basically, just deny that something happened. Like, for example, if somebody told me that a close friend died, I might say that that's not possible, that's not true, and I would resist the idea of that reality. Okay, so Freud said that this was an unconscious drive for me to protect myself from that suffering. And then Freud applied that concept to therapy. Freud said that healing and progress would involve suffering and would involve a whole lot of psychological work, and that would basically mean that people would often push back against change and against what happens in therapy. And another thing that Freud talked about was psychosexual development and fixation. So Freud, again, in a very basic sense, I'm watering this down quite much, but Freud basically said that we had several phases where we experience pleasure. Okay, so those would be oral pleasure when we're babies, then it would be anal pleasure, and it will go all the way to genital pleasure. So there were several phases that a person goes through, and according to Freud, we would need to go through several, we would call them developmental assignments today in modern theories, but Freud called them phases of psychosexual development. And what is pretty important about this is that this was the very first theory that put humans in stages of growth in this way. So Freud said that if you didn't complete certain tasks in each phase, you would get fixated. And this is actually where the popular idea of trauma in childhood comes from. So Freud said that if something traumatic happens to you, you wouldn't be able to go to the next phase. So that would mean that in adulthood, when most people start to realize that they have problems, and I think it's important to say that Freud actually only treated adults in his time, Freud said that you will need to get out of the fixations. So you will need to resolve that conflict that happened in childhood, which would be in your unconscious mind. I hope that's not too convoluted. Maybe some other time we can get more into the nuances of psychoanalytic therapy, but that's more or less how it works. And these are all influential concepts that apply in some regard to other theories too. So let's go to another theory, another alternative that we have that are humanistic perspectives. And I call them, and I'm naming them in plural because of this. There are several theories that you could group into humanistic perspectives, but they have several things in common. One thing, and I think it's the most important one, is that they understand humans holistically. So they wouldn't understand humans as unconscious drives, as psychoanalysis would do. They would understand humans as a complete whole. So that what they're trying to do with that is not miss out on other things. So you wouldn't miss out on maybe biological functions, you wouldn't miss out on society, you wouldn't miss out on their families. They really try to understand humans, some would say, as they appear, right? If you would go for a more phenomenological angle. They place emphasis on patient-therapist relationship. And this is because they often reject the idea of objective truths. They go more for human experience. So I, as a therapist, I am not an expert in what happens in the patient's mind. I would need for the patient to tell me what is happening to them, and I would need for them to relate to me in some way for this style of therapy to work. So that means the relationship is often horizontal. Well, the therapist is always in a position of authority relative to the patient. But in this specific perspective, that hierarchy gets played down. It gets downplayed to something that is more horizontal. Okay, so what the patient says often has just as much relevance to the process as what the therapist thinks or says. And this is really important because it means that the relationship that gets formed there is really, really important, more so than in other perspectives. It often engages in philosophical thought. This would be where existential therapy comes from. It gets a lot of its influence from existential thinkers like Heidegger, Sartre, and Nietzsche. And they coined the term person-centered therapy or client-centered therapy. That was Rogers, that is right below there. And it basically means that what happens in therapy is centered around the patient. That's, okay, that was redundant. What that means is that the goals are set by the patient and not by the therapist. As we heard about in Freud, Freud had a goal. It was to discover the unconscious patterns and solve them. Right here, it's Roger said, well, how about we let the patient decide their own thought, their own goals, right? So again, that's a simplification, but that's basically what Roger said. And this was a pretty influential concept. It seems obvious by today's standards, but it was a pretty big deal when Rogers made it. Other people were Perls with Gestalt therapy and Maslow with a hierarchy of needs, which some people have heard about. Some concepts here. Dasein. Dasein is, like I said, humanistic perspectives often draw from existential philosophy. Dasein is a term that comes from phenomenological theories, specifically from Heidegger. Heidegger was an existential phenomenologist, and his concept of Dasein is actually pretty complicated because phenomenology is pretty dense in itself, but it basically means it describes a way about how humans exist, right? So Dasein basically means that we are beings for whom our own being is a problem. So we think about ourselves. And there's like an 800 book describing this. But that's basically what it means. Dasein thinks about itself, and it also exists in a world in which the subject that will be us, Dasein, is actively involved in and is actually valuing it, okay? We don't have time to get into the specifics of Dasein, but we will get into the realm of philosophy, but that's basically what it means. As we've talked about client-centered therapy, and another concept that is pretty important here is unconditional acceptance. So Rogers thought that if you gave clients a space where they could grow, they would naturally grow into better versions of themselves. So he said that we would need to unconditionally accept patients, whatever they say they like, we would need to accept it. So they would need, the clients would feel safe, and they would be in the mindset that would let them grow. Okay, so that's a humanistic perspective. Let's get to behavioral therapy. Behavioral therapy understands humans as stimulus response. So what does that mean? Remember how we talked about psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis taught that we are unconscious drives. Then humanistic perspectives tells us, well, we need to understand everything. Behavioral therapy is more like a natural science, like in the biology or physics. So behavioral therapy would basically say that there is a stimulus, like it would be in this case like this class, and there would be a response, like how you respond to this class. So if I gave you, for example, if you did something that I liked you doing, I would reinforce your behavior. I would give you maybe a cookie. I would give you a star. And behavioral therapy would say that that augments the possibility that you might act in that way in the future, okay? So it focuses really, really, really hard on observable behavior and objectively measurable data. And that's what they were basically trying to do, this Pavlov and Skinner. They were trying to make a hard science out of psychology. And they say that they could do that if we only thought about behavior. So this makes this theory very practical because it gives you observable data. We don't have access to people's mind states, but we can observe the data, we can record it, and we can measure it very easily. And there are methods to do that. So this was what these guys were trying to do. Despite that, it has fallen out of favor, but it's still applied in certain contexts. Pure behavioral therapy is not done in today's world, but its concepts are used in another style of therapy that we're going to talk about soon. They're applied in classrooms often, and parenthood often involves this. And what they often do, they don't know how they're called, but it's usually operative conditioning, what we do with our children. So operative conditioning means that you do something and then I respond to you in a way, depending if I want to make the behavior more probable to happen or less probable to happen. Okay, so operative conditioning, for example, what's a good example? If I tell my child to come by 11 o'clock in the night and he arrives at that time, I might give him a reward, or in this language, it would be a positive reinforcement. And that would make it more probable that my child would voluntarily make himself go in time to the home, right? In contrast, if he arrives late, I might punish him in some way. I might ground him. I might maybe beat him. Some people do that, unfortunately. I might take away some sort of privilege that he has. So operative conditioning is basically that somebody does something and you reinforce it or punish it in some other ways. So you try to control the behavior. This is in contrast to classical conditioning. Classical conditioning would be, classical conditioning would be relating two different stimuli to make them appear together. So the classic example is that of a dog. A dog salivates when they see food, right? So you would ring a bell, then you would present the dog food, and the dog would salivate. So the dog would associate the ringing of the bell with the food. So eventually you could make the dog salivate just on the bell ring alone. So that's classical conditioning. Operative conditioning is called that way because the subject is operating on the world. And you might have heard about something called Skinner box. This is often used in loot box systems in video games, and it's also used in casinos to control people going to the casinos and betting. Okay, I hope that's clear. I'm also hoping I'm not going too fast, but we only have 30 minutes for this class, so I'm trying to go real quick. Cognitive behavioral therapy. So remember that I said before that behavioral therapy is not used as much anymore in therapeutic context. And that's because basically all of its concepts are reductive. And they take away the part of the human that thinks for itself, the subjective part. And a lot of people don't like that. I myself don't like that. And a lot of patients don't like being treated that way. And it's also not very practical because the therapist doesn't have the resources. Well, they often don't have the resources to go to the patient's environment and actually reinforce the things that are happening in there. However, while you are in therapy, you can apply something that is called cognitive techniques. Okay, so cognitive behavioral therapy would understand mental health as a conscious process. So this is in stark rejection of psychoanalysis, if you listen to this closely, because they say it's a conscious process, while psychoanalysis would say that it's an unconscious process. Okay? So it focuses on correcting mental schemes. They often don't get into things that we don't think about consciously. So for example, if I had a certain model of partner relationships, if I got along badly with my girlfriend or my wife, a cognitive behavioral therapist would look at this relationship in terms of schemes. They would look at my way of thinking about my relationship and how it's not working, okay? So that sounds really practical, and it's because it is. And it's the most popular form of therapy right now. And it's because it has a lot of empirical backing, because it's very easy to research into this, because you can basically just ask the patients how are you feeling right now and how are you feeling after therapy? What were you thinking before and you were thinking after therapy? And that's not something that is as easily done with other methods of therapy. It's also relatively easy to apply. It uses a very accessible concepts and techniques. So it's basically the most common form of therapy right now. It's also not that long. Usually it takes about 12 sessions, which is about 3 months, whereas a psychoanalytic therapy might take years. Humanistic therapists vary a lot. So that's something that his theory has in its favor. And Ellis, Beck, and Lazarus, we're going to talk about them in a bit. They talked about these concepts, which were schemes. Like we talked about, schemes are basically collections of thoughts and ideas we have about something. So I thought about my scheme about relationship, for example. So maybe my scheme of a husband, which would be my case, well, I'm not married, but hypothetically, my scheme of a husband will be someone that brings bread to the table, works a certain amount of hours a day, gives certain attention to my children, treats my wife in a certain way. And maybe those concepts are not working for me right now. So I would change that scheme. Ellis would say that you would have irrational thoughts. Irrational thoughts are basically, there are another way to think about my own processes. So Ellis said that we had certain patterns of thought that were not functional for us. So he would say that there was an A, an antecedent, there was a C, a consequence. So for example, maybe I break up with my girlfriend and then I get very sad and I get into depression and it all goes terrible. So Ellis would say that it's not the part where I am breaking up with my girlfriend that is a problem. It's the part that is in the middle, the process where I think about it. So he called that B for belief system. And the belief system would be in that maybe my girlfriend was my whole life, and now that I don't have her, I don't have anything else to go for. Maybe it would be that being single is terrible. Whatever it is, Ellis tried to find out the B part, not the A part and not the C part. So it's a very, very rationally focused therapy. And lastly, there are cognitive distortions. That's from Beck. Cognitive distortions are wrong processes in how we perceive reality, according to Beck. So Beck would say that there was certain objective truths to reality, and a patient would have certain distortions that don't let them see reality well, and that would involve unhealthy processes. I hope that's clear too. So let's get to systemic therapy. Systemic therapy understands humans as part of a system, and that's extremely redundant, and I'm very sorry for that, but I don't know how else to put it. Notice how the other types of therapy are often focusing themselves on a single individual. And it's not that group therapy can't be done with them, but it's not what they're usually used for. So, sorry. So in this theory, we would understand that humans exist in a system. So that would be like a family system, maybe a society. It depends on the specific theory. And we can see on screen, right over here, a model done by Brofenebener, sorry. What it has individual right here. It has the microsystem, so it will be your family, your close friends, etc. And it goes all the way up to culture. So there are several layers that we could potentially ignore if we only focus on the individual. So these people would not necessarily say that the individual has a problem. They would say that the system has a problem. Obviously, you cannot change culture in therapy, but if you narrow it down to family, you can probably do something about families, right? So this is why it's popular in family and couples therapy, because you're not understanding problems as individual things. You're understanding them as a result of a systemic process. So this uses system theory, which is actually not something that psychologists thought of, but they kind of borrow it for this one. We're not going to get into specifics of system theory. Some people here at Moninchin and Haley, which had models of family and how they should work. And they said that if you're not following that model, you're going to have problems. And there are several types of systemic theories. We're not going to get into specifics of them, but they basically all have their own way of seeing families. and how to treat families, okay? Now, let's compare them real quick. In psychoanalysis, humans are unconscious drives. In humanistic perspectives, they are complete wholes. In cognitive behavioral therapies, they are unconscious thoughts and actions. And in systemic therapy, they are part of a system. So that makes their interests already very, very different from one another. So notice how from these four perspectives, you can pull a lot of tools and a lot of different concepts that you can apply to humans. And maybe when you're hearing all of this, they all sound useful to you. And that's because they are. They're all useful for treating therapy, for treating patients. In my case, I tend to prefer humanistic therapy because I really like philosophy and I like existentialism, but they have all taught me very useful things. I've used cognitive behavioral therapy in workshops. I've used psychoanalysis very, very often when I'm supervising my sessions, when I'm speculating about what is happening with my patients. I usually use psychoanalysis because it helps me speculate about what is happening that my patient is not telling me, okay? And systemic therapy helps me remember that my patient is not that is going on, all that is going on. So that way I don't put the whole burden of the problem in my patient, because often people will have certain problems. For example, maybe their mothers are undergoing a heavy depression. Maybe they have a problem at home. Maybe they have a problem at school. Maybe they have a fundamental problem in how they relate to their own culture. But I cannot fix that. Despite that, keeping this in mind helps me think that maybe my patient doesn't have all the power to do everything about their own life. And that's pretty important too. It's also, to be fair, the one that I've studied the least, but I still find it useful. And I think it's a very useful therapy. So some important concepts, as we talked about, resistances, fixation, and personality structure in psychoanalysis. Personality structure is basically the idea that we have like an unconscious drive to pleasure, an unconscious drive to uphold rules, and we have like our conscious patterns that are mediating those. So we talked about resistance as a fixation, and that's something that all styles of therapy usually use. Humanistic perspectives gave us unconditional acceptance, which is now taken as obvious and for granted when doing therapy. We're going to talk about that in a bit. Cognitive behavioral therapists use something that is called self-acceptance. That's something that Ellis said. Ellis said that we shouldn't love ourselves. We should just see ourselves and accept that we are in certain ways and we can work on that. And he said that that was more functional because you would not hurt yourself over things that you don't like about yourself. Maybe I don't like that I sleep too much, that I'm not as good at handling my time as I am. Maybe I don't like that. But if I accept it, I can work on it more easily than if I love myself unconditionally. If I love myself, maybe I would say, screw everything, that's the way I am. But if I hated myself for that, maybe I wouldn't have motivation to work myself. So that's something that Ellis really liked. We talked about schemes, and we also talked about systems in systemic therapy, okay? Contributions. Psychoanalysis gave us talk therapy. Talk therapy is basically how all psychotherapy works now. There's some more modern styles that are trying to move away from that, but it's all based around the idea that talking or relating to a certain person will help them grow in a professional setting. So that's something that Freud talked about first, and he gave us that, and we have to respect him for that. Humanistic therapies gave us person-centered therapy, which is also taken for granted, as we talked about earlier. Cognitive behavioral therapies basically spawned emotional regulation, which is a kind of a more modern perspective of how emotions work. I think a good movie that talks about it is Inside Out, the Disney movie. Really talks about emotional regulation and how ignoring emotions is not good for us. So what you would basically try to do in emotional regulation is make patients aware of their emotions, look at them, but not ignore them, but not also overindulge in them. It's a very cognitive process, and it's very, very useful when treating children, but also when treating adults. We often don't have a good handle on how we experience our emotions. And according to Ellis, we would have a better way of doing that if we focus on what we thought and not only how we felt. Systemic therapy was postmodern therapy, and that's another theory in itself. Postmodern therapy applies postmodernist concepts, forgive me for the redundancy, to therapy. So they would reject the idea of hierarchies. They often reject the idea of objective reality. And systemic therapy also gave us family therapy. Now, some pros. Psychoanalysis gave us an exhaustive theory. It's really robust. It gives us a lot of concepts to think about. It also gives us good narratives and stories to think about people. And according to them, it gets to the root of the problem. So you don't go to the, think about it in medicine, which is appropriate given that Freud was a doctor himself. When you go to a doctor, you're not hoping for them to cure your symptoms, right? You're hoping for them to kill the virus. So the virus would be the root. The root in psychoanalysis would be my unconscious drive to whatever. It wouldn't be the suffering in itself that it's causing me. So that's what psychoanalysis is trying to do. Humanistic therapists let the patient grow as they desire. And that's pretty good because it means that you're not forcing a certain scheme or goal into your patient. And that makes it really useful. Cognitive behavioral therapy is very practical, it's effective, and it's backed by research, more so than other theories. That's why it's the most popular one, as we talked about before. And systemic therapy does something that often it's kind of easy to overlook in other modes of thought, but it puts special emphasis on other people, not just in your individual patients. Some criticisms that they've had is that psychoanalysis is difficult to measure. You cannot observe unconscious drives in a way that you can observe behavior. As I said before, it's also a pretty convoluted theory. It's not very easy to study psychoanalysis. It takes years, it takes supervision, and it takes a lot of practice. And its concepts are often kind of obscure too. Humanistic therapists will say that it's hard for the patient. Often they would say that, well, it's the theory that I use the most. So they would say that we are maybe too intrusive for the patient. This is because this has to do with its existentialist origins, since it's a theory based around existentialism. Existentialism is often seen also as kind of, well, in layman's terms, it's seen as kind of a bummer. It's not my opinion. I don't agree with that, but it's often what they say about it. And they often say that it's not scientific. I also think that that's not a very fair criticism, given that it has a very phenomenological grounding. But some people accuse it of that. People accuse cognitive behavioral therapy of being reductive because you're only going to conscious drives. You're not looking at much else. And they would say that maybe humans are not as simple as that. And systemic criticism against systemic therapy would be that it's hard to look at specific individuals, which is the reverse of what systemic therapy tries to do. Okay, what do they all have in common? And what do we have to keep in mind while doing therapy? Well, regardless of your theory, these are things that you will always need while doing therapy. You will need active listening. So active listening is not simply listening as you might do when hearing about gossip about a friend, maybe talking about doing small talk or something else. Active listening is focusing really hard on what the person is saying. You're looking at their posture, how they're, well, you cannot look at it because you can only see my face right now, but maybe you would see how my legs are crossed right now, how my voice pitch is changing, how my cadence of speaking is changing, my mannerisms while talking. You cannot see my hands, but I'm really moving my hands right now, etc. So active listening looks really hard to all of these factors. It's not just literally listening to the words of the patient. You would also look about what they're not saying, at what points they're changing the subject. It's a really, really useful skill, not just for therapy, but for conflict resolution and as personal life choice. So even if you're not going to be a therapist, I think it's something to keep in mind. Now, the best predictor to success in therapy is not what theory you your use. It's actually therapeutic alliance, and therapeutic alliance is a relationship in where patient and therapists are working towards the same goal, and the patient feels that the therapist is kind of on their side. Okay, so for that, the therapist has to do something that is called rapport. Rapport, you can think about rapport as in confidence. You give the client confidence that you will be able to help them out. The client thinks about you in good terms. They don't think that you're opposing their growth, and etc. This sounds pretty obvious, but when you get down to the specifics of therapy, it's not as easy as you might think. And there are several techniques to develop that too. You will need also empathy and or perspective taking. I'm adding perspective taking, which is a much more modern concept that is getting studied since a couple of decades ago. And I prefer it because I feel like empathy is kind of tried right now. We're always saying that we need to be more empathetic of other people, think, walk in the shoes, etc. But I think perspective taking is a more nuanced take on that. And that's because perspective taking often doesn't only involve emotions, it also involves thoughts. So I prefer it over empathy, but either is fine. You need to be able to feel what your patient is saying, but also think how they will think. And lastly, you need interviewing skills. And that could be a whole course in itself. And it often is when majoring in psychology. There is a whole host of tools for interviewing, several types of interviewing styles. And that's something that you need to keep in mind when doing therapy. And well, that's all I have to say about that. I hope you enjoyed this class, and I hope you find it useful. And thank you for your time.